Right. So this is the first time I'm giving this talk, and I actually showed it to my wife a couple days ago, and I thought I'd share her feedback with you. She said the second half is not as boring as the first. So my advice to you is hang in there. The first half only takes about 10 minutes. So web typography covers a lot of areas, but what I want to talk about today are web fonts, OpenType features, kerning, hyphenation, and justification. These are the kind of topics that you usually use in your work. So I'm going to talk about what they are, how to use them, and what kind of browser support they have. So I'm going to start with web fonts. Well, a couple of years ago, we only had web-safe fonts like Arial, Verdana, Times New Roman, etc. And now we can use any font, for example, Freight Sans, and you can see it makes quite a big difference. So I assume most of you are also familiar with the @fontface syntax. You take any font, a normal font, you put it on your server, and you define a web font using the fontface syntax. And then you use it in your font stack as normal, as you would any local font. Now I want to point out that the font family name is just a label. It doesn't mean anything to the browser. So you could, for example, give a font family name of Helvetica Neue and then point it to Comic Sans. And that will work. That will just work. Your colleagues might not like it that much, but it will work. Also, if you're wondering about whether you should put quotes around the family name or not, then please ask Matthias. He really enjoys that sort of thing. So this is what you would usually see if you look at a fontface declaration. So what is this mess all about? Do we really need this? So to answer that, we need to dive a bit into font formats. So you have TrueType files, you have OpenType files, you have SVG fonts, you have EOT, embedded OpenType, you have the Web Open Font Format, and then you have the Web Open Font Format 2, which is a great original name. So these are actually the only two true file formats, and these are the same ones that you would use on a desktop. The difference between them is in the way they store the outlines of each character. That doesn't really matter that much, except that, in my opinion, OpenType files render slightly better across platforms because they're more consistent. So let's talk about SVG fonts. And unlike most other people here today, I really hate SVG, specifically SVG fonts. They're not fonts at all. It's kind of a misnomer. They're just SVG files with the shapes of each character in them, and none of the other features of web fonts. No OpenType features, no kerning, nothing. So my recommendation is don't use SVG ever. There's no need for it. All the browsers that support SVG fonts, they support one of the other formats. So just use those instead, and you get a real font with all the nice features. So that leaves the other three. So what are they if they're not font file formats? Well, they are what we call container formats, which means that they contain one of the other two formats, either a TrueType or an OpenType file. You can compare it a bit to a zip file, for example. It's a compressed archive with something else in it. So the difference between these three is that EOT was developed by Microsoft a long time ago, and it was the very first web font format, or container format, I should say. Then when the other browsers wanted to implement web fonts, they decided to develop the Web Open Font format. And that worked quite well until quite recently when the W3C decided that we could achieve better compression rates. So that's why the WAF2 format was developed. So let's take a look at browser support for these formats. You can see right away that EOT is not supported by any browser other than IE. And also that IE8 only supports EOT. So if you need to support IE8, and how many of you support IE8? Oh, wow, you poor people. So you still need an EOT file. So, but if you don't support IE8, then you can also leave out the EOT file, which simplifies your font face syntax. What also stands out is that WAF2 doesn't have much support, which can be explained, but it's a new format, so it doesn't have much support yet. And I expect that to improve in the coming months and years. So if you're developing for modern browsers, which I guess most of you don't then, this is what I recommend to use for font face syntax. You put WAF2 file first for the browsers that support it, so you get better compression rates. And then you use WAF for everything else, which gives you coverage for IE 9+ and pretty much every modern browser. If you need to support all the browsers, not IE8, then you can include either an OpenType or a TrueType file as well, which gives you IE 9+, Android 2.3+, iOS 4.3, etc. And this is much simpler and nicer and cleaner than the mess that I showed you before. So the font face syntax has a couple of other properties, and you might recognize these from styling in CSS. You have font style, font weight, and font stretch. So in this context, they're a little bit different because they're used as labels, not as ways to specify a value. So for example, you can do the same trick that I did before and give it a label that doesn't match what font you point to. So for example, here I've given it a font weight of 100 and then pointed it to a very heavy weight. And it will work just fine. Again, the browser will just render it. You might be in for a surprise if your fonts filter loads and your fallback font does something completely different. Now, if you combine font stretch and font weight, then you have like 81 categories to place your web font in. And if you add font style, then you actually have 243 different options to categorize your font, which is quite a lot. It should be enough for most font families. Most font families are actually below that number, but there are some that are even larger than that. So there's two more properties that are supported on the font face property, or rule, I should say. Those are font variant and font feature settings, which are not labels, but they allow you to define initial values for the web font. So if you want to enable a specific OpenType feature, then you can do that with these properties. Then you have Unicode range, which tells the browser which characters are included in the font. And it can use that information to only download the font that it needs. So if there are several characters on a page that are not in the font, it doesn't need to download it, for example. So, for example, if you have a site with mostly English content, but also some, let's say, Chinese, you need a rather large font because Chinese has a lot of characters to support this site. So, for example, let's say the font size is 2.1 megabytes, which is way too much to download on each and every request. Your users are going to hate you. So what you do is you split them up into two subsets, one with Latin, which supports English, and one with Chinese, which is for your Chinese users. And then you can use Unicode range to define two web fonts under the same family name. And if you give it the correct ranges, then the browser will only download the subset for English on the pages with only English. And it will download both subsets on pages with both English and Chinese, or only Chinese if you have a full page that's only Chinese. So now this is all pretty nice, but let's take a look at browser support for this. The basic properties are pretty well supported. Font family is supported, font style, font weight, everything supports that. The problem is with font stretch. There's not such good support for that. IE8, Chrome, Safari, and Opera do not support it. Which means that if you go back to these 243 categories and we exclude font stretch, that actually limits you to only 27 options, which is way too limited if you want to categorize and label your fonts correctly. So that's a huge problem. Then font variant, and I had a fun time testing this one. There's not a single browser that supports that on your font face syntax. And even some browsers refuse to render web fonts if you use it. So don't use it. Font feature settings is only supported by Firefox, which means you pretty much can't use it either. Now, this is not really a big problem because these define initial values, so you can still set the same style on the elements that you apply the web font to. What's disappointing is the support for Unicode range. It's only the WebKits that support it, Chrome, Safari, and Opera. They will download the fonts, the subsets that are used on the page, but the other browsers won't. So that means you will need to manually include each subset on the page that uses them. So let's move on to OpenType features. I'm just going to take a sip. Are there any type designers in the audience? No? Good. I'm going to say some horrible things about OpenType features. So I find it usually pretty hard to explain what OpenType features are, and I'm sure there's a nice definition of it, but I thought it's easier to show you. And I've picked 6 of them, but there are more than 130 registered features. And I should also point out that not all fonts include all features, so you might have a font with 0, or you might have a font with 8 or 9 features, or whatever. And I picked these because they're kind of representative of what's commonly available. So you have ligatures, which merge 2 characters when they're close together. Then you have discretionary ligatures, which do the same thing, but more for stylistic purposes instead of readability. You have contextual alternates, which replace characters based on the context. So for example, you can see the parentheses here. They're a little bit low for the uppercase CSS. And if contextual alternates were enabled, it would replace those parentheses with slightly different ones that are slightly higher. And then it would look a little bit better. You have alt style numerals, which can be used in running text instead of full-size numerals. Same thing for acronyms. You can use small caps, for example. And stylistic alternates are kind of like alternate versions of characters that might be in your font. Now, this is how the CSS font module would like you to use this. This is defined. So they've extended the font variant property, and you can now add new keywords there, like common ligatures, small caps, and also no common ligatures. So for example, here I enable common ligatures on the span and small caps, and I disable ligatures on the menu. Now this is really nice, I think. I like the syntax. But there's no browser that actually supports it. So what they want you to use is font feature settings, which is a bit more low-level interface. And that uses the feature tags, which are like the internal tags that are used in the font to define each OpenType feature. And you can do pretty much the same thing. You can turn them on and turn them off, and etc. So again, let's take a look at browser support. As you can see, IE8 and IE9 don't support any of this, so you can forget about it there. And then the other interesting thing is that Safari has a sort of support, in that it accepts the syntax and it parses it, and you can give it values, but it will just ignore it. So I don't know how to classify browser support for that, but you can see that, for example, it has discretionary ligatures turned on by, it has ligatures turned on by default, but discretionary ligatures are always disabled. So you would need to, there's no way to turn them on if you wanted to have them. So I wanted to move to another OpenType feature, which is often discussed separately, which is kerning. But it is in fact an OpenType feature. So this is how a font stores character outline glyphs, what we usually call them. And these are all separately stored, of course, and they are defined with a bounding box. And say your font doesn't have any kerning data in it, then this is what the browser would do. It would just smash those boxes together and say, this is a word now. It works okay. I mean, you can read it. But it would be better if the boxes could overlap a little bit. And that is pretty much what kerning is. There are instructions that the type designer puts into a font about by how much each bounding box can overlap for specific character combinations. And this is actually much more readable. So you would want to have kerning in your font, and you want it enabled in CSS. So this is what, again, the CSS specification wants you to use. Font kerning, you can set it to auto, which is you telling the browser, say, if you want to kern, fine. If you don't want to do it, then okay. Normal enables kerning if there's kerning data in the font. and none, you don't get any kerning at all. So browser support. Safari surprisingly supports it, which I had to check like 3 or 4 times because I didn't believe it. The trick is that Safari already enables kerning by default, so you can only use it to turn it off, which I'm not sure why you want to do that. So what you should use instead is again, the font feature settings property, and use the kern feature tag. And again, this is an OpenType feature, so you can enable a template like that. If you want to be particularly future-proof, you can add font kerning, which will work in Safari. And also, I see a lot of people recommend using the text rendering property, and that's not an official CSS property. And there are also many bugs in its implementation, so it does all sorts of weird things if you enable that. So I don't recommend using that to enable kerning. So browser support for font feature settings, we've kind of gone over it. IE8, IE9, again, I'm going to be saying this a lot. Forget about it. Safari, interesting, supports it, doesn't support it, but again, Safari has kerning enabled already, and you can use the font kerning property there, so yay. Now, I just talked about the spacing between characters, and I want to move on to talking about the spacing between words, which is where hyphenation justification comes in. So justification has been supported for a very long time in CSS. I'm sure you're all familiar with the text align property. You can align things right, center, and you can justify things. And this works in every browser. However, there's a problem when you decrease the column size. It starts to create rather large gaps between words, which hurts readability. And I've kind of highlighted them here, so it makes it more obvious. And this is a real problem, and especially noticeable if you add up all the white space. And you can see that it almost adds a whole line to a half line, 1.5 line of white space in the worst case. And this hurts readability. I mean, your eye has to keep track of all these words and jump over all this extra white space. And there's another thing that it affects. It also affects your design by changing the typographic color of your text. And what I mean is that if you look at a piece of text and you squint a little bit, and I've been doing that a lot, so I don't recommend doing that a lot. But if you do that a lot, then you should see like an even color for each block of text, which is kind of the goal to have. And you can see here that it didn't really work out that well. So this problem is solved by hyphenating. It adds more breakpoints into your text, so the algorithm can justify better. So this is with hyphenation turned on, and you can see it already looks much better. Especially when you look at the typographic color, you can see that the leftmost column is a complete even color now, and the center column is much better. The rightmost column still has some problems, but it's much better. Especially when you compare before and after, you can really see a big difference. So how do you enable this in CSS? First of all, you need to declare a language property on your HTML element, and this will tell the browser which hyphenation dictionary to use. You can also declare it on the whole document or specific elements or whatever you need to support the languages that you have. And then you use the hyphens property, and you set it to auto, which means please hyphenate this for me. You can also set it to manual, which means that it will hyphenate only at explicit breakpoints like hyphens or soft hyphens that you manually inserted. You can also set it to none, which I think is the default value in some browsers, which means don't hyphenate at all. Now, browser support for this is pretty good. IE8 and IE9, I'm not going to even start talking about that. But all other browsers support the property, sort of. Chrome and Opera, they support the property, and you can set it, and all is good, except that they don't come with any hyphenation dictionary, which means that you don't get hyphenation. Yeah. So I hope this will be fixed soon, but until then, you can use a client-side solution. I just happen to have written one, which you can use. You can just give it a selector, and you can call hyphenate, and you give it a language, and it will hyphenate that properly. And it's really fast, so you don't need to worry about performance either. Now, hyphenation solves bad justification, but it also introduces some new problems. As you can see here, there are 2 consecutive lines with hyphenation. This is considered bad because it creates an uneven look. And the CSS4 specification, which actually exists, introduces a new property to solve this problem, which is called hyphenate limit lines. And you can use it to limit the number of lines that have hyphens in them. And if you set it to 1, for example, then you can have 1 line ending with a hyphen, and then you need another line without a hyphen before it kicks in again. Or you can set it to no limit if you don't care. Now, there's also a problem with hyphenating the last line of a word. It may not be that obvious in this example, but imagine you had 2 columns and the last part of the last word moves to the top of the next column. So your user would have to read down and then skip back up, which makes it really hard to read. So luckily, the CSS4 specification handles that as well, which I think this is a bit confusing. You can set it to hyphenate limit last always, which disallows hyphenation, and you set it to none, which allows hyphenation of the last word. Which, I don't know, I think it's confusing. Now, yet another problem is hyphenation after only a limited number of characters. So as you can see here that the browser has hyphenated after only 2 characters, which is ugly because it's hard to read and it breaks the word awkwardly. Luckily, there's yet another new property, which is called hyphenate limit characters, and the default value is auto. So, and what auto means is that it considers all hyphenation points as acceptable, except for words that can't be hyphenated, like the words is and for here. So you can set the first value, which limits the word length, the length of the word that is considered for hyphenation. So I set it to 7 here, which excluded the word needed. The second value controls the minimum number of characters before a hyphenation point. So I set it to 3 here, which kind of excludes the first hyphenation point in hyphenation. Maybe I should have picked a better example for that. Hyphenation. Yeah. So the last value controls the number of characters at the end of a word that are considered. So, for example, I set it to 5 here, which excludes the last part of the word justification. So this allows you to control where a word breaks, and the goal is to let it break somewhere in the middle. So the CSS specification also solves some problems that I don't think we have. For example, all these pesky hyphens at the end of a word. So you can tell it to change the hyphenation character into something other than a hyphen. So for example, you can change it to a star if you really wanted to. I don't know about that, if it's a good idea or not. So browser support for that is rather interesting. As you can see, IE, IE9, whatever. IE 10 and 11 actually support all of this, except the most useless one, which is not that surprising because this specification and this standard comes from Microsoft. And Microsoft has been doing a really great job at pushing typography. I think if I had to rank browsers into a list about best web font support or best type support, I would say Firefox, IE, and then somewhere at the bottom is Chrome and Opera and all the WebKit stuff. So as you can see here that all the Chrome, Firefox, and Safari and Opera don't support any of these properties. Now, I also doubt the usefulness of these properties. I think that a good justification algorithm should do these things automatically. It should know whether 2 consecutive lines end with hyphens and just avoid it by default. It should also not break words at strange points. I mean, that should just be part of the dictionary. So I worry or wonder about the future of these properties, and especially about the hyphenate character. I can't see myself using that ever. So, like I said before, there are many other topics to explore. I listed them at the beginning. You have font loading, you have type rendering, you have all sorts of stuff. And there's also a lot of data on which browsers support what. And so that's why I'm starting a new initiative. It's called the State of Web Type. And you can find it on stateofwebtype.com, which is kind of like a can I use .com, but then focused on web type. I'm going to put these slides online, and I will also add more data in the coming months. So that's where I'd like to end now. If you have any questions, or if you're interested in web typography, please follow me on Twitter or find me afterwards for questions. Thank you.